We'll push it. Anyway, can I just take a second to say a few words about Shakespeare and the recorder, because I got curious about whether this was really a good mix or not. And there actually is a quote about the recorder in the play we're reading now, though we haven't quite reached it yet. And it's after they're starting to do the play, and Hippolyta and the other people in the audience are commenting on the play. And in this case, they're commenting on the quality of the prologue in a rather disparaging way. And Hippolyta says, "Indeed, he hath played on this prologue like a child on a recorder, a sound, but not in government." So we'll try to do this in government, but no guarantees. And I just have to share this Hamlet quote. Guildenstern is attempting to get information out of Hamlet. Hamlet knows what's going on and has a recorder in his hand and is trying to persuade Guildenstern to play on this recorder. And Guildenstern is protesting that he cannot. He does not know how to make it speak. And Hamlet says, "I do beseech you." And Guildenstern said, "I know no touch of it, my lord." And Hamlet replies, "'Tis as easy as lying. Govern these vintages with your finger and thumb, give it breath with your mouth, and it will discourse most eloquent music. Look you, these are the stops." And Guildenstern, panicking, says, "But these cannot I command to any utterance of harmony. I have not the skill." And Hamlet, making his point, says, "Why, look you now how unworthy a thing you make of me. You would play upon me. You would seem to know my stops. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery. You would sound me from my lowest note to the top of my compass. And there is much music, excellent voice in this little organ, yet cannot you make it speak. Blood, do you think I am easier to be played on than a pipe? Call me what instrument you will, though you can fret me, you cannot play upon me." So I think Hamlet got the better of that exchange, but neither reference to the recorder is terribly flattering. We'll see how this goes. The first thing we have for you is a song by Thomas Morley, who was a Shakespeare contemporary. In fact, when Shakespeare first moved to London, they lived in the same parish, and the records indicate that they even owed exactly the same amount of tax, which was a whopping £5, I think. So they probably did know each other. Morley set a lot of Shakespeare's lyrics. 2 of them were published in Shakespeare's lifetime, and this is one of them. It more or less parallels the song as it was sung until you get to about the last third of it, where it sort of wanders off and does all sorts of instrumental stuff, but I didn't get around to rearranging it, so that's what you get. The words, this is from Twelfth Night. It's "O Mistress Mine." When Sir Toby Belch requests a love song, the clown sings, "O mistress mine, where are you roaming? O stay and hear your true love's coming, that can sing both high and low. Trip no further, pretty sweeting, journey's end and lovers' meeting, every wise man's son doth know. What is love? 'Tis not hereafter. Present mirth hath present laughter. What's to come is still unsure. In delay there lies no plenty. Then come and kiss me, sweet and 20. Youth's a stuff will not endure." So, we will play it. And if anyone wants to sing along, here are the words. Once. Okay.
How did it ever get the name recorder?
Well, I've heard a couple of different theories on that. That it came from recordo or memory or keepsake. I think that may be a little far-fetched. I'm really not sure. It's not, of course, called that everywhere. It's a walk flute, or I guess a wooden flute in German. It's a flauto dolce or a sweet flute in Italian. I'm fond of that one. It's always some kind of a flute, though. The next thing we found, we really aren't going to do a Ricardian 10 minutes here, but this is one of the one of the songs that Autolycus, remember the peddler Autolycus, the outrageous fellow in Winter's Tale, was selling? Where the servant comes in and says, he hath songs for man or woman of all sizes. No milliner can so fit his customers with gloves. He hath the prettiest love songs for maids, so without bawdry, which is strange, with such delicate burdens of dildos and fadings, jumper and thumper. And where some stretch-mouthed rascal would, as it were, mean mischief, and break a foul jape into the matter, he makes the maid to answer, whoop, do me no harm, good man. Puts him off, slights him with, whoop, do me no harm, good man. And we found, whoop, do me no harm, good man. The words did not survive, but the tune did. It's got a little echo effect in it, so tune is going to be the echo.
Sounds like Randy Newman, early Randy Newman.
Very early. Okay, what are we doing here? This is Where the Bee Sucks, Ariel's Song from the Tempest. It's not exactly Puck, but I figured it might be close enough. This is by Robert Johnson, who was credited with writing music for the several of the plays at their first performances. This may be the original version of this. What instrument do I need, please? This one. Oh, and the words. Where the bee sucks, there suck I. In a cowslip's bell I lie. There I couch when owls do cry. On the bat's back I do fly. After summer merrily. Merrily, merrily shall I live now under the blossom that hangs on the bough. I don't really get the little thing here. I get it really easy. Shakespeare connection with the recorder that I'd like to just briefly mention before we get into the next piece here. In about 1540, there were 5 brothers from near Venice in Italy, the Bassano brothers, who came over to take up their new positions as the recorder consort at the British court. The youngest, Battista, had a daughter named Emilia Bassano, and quite a few scholars now think that the Dark Lady of the Shakespeare sonnets may well have been Emilia Bassano, whose family was originally a family of Sephardic Jews who converted, although it appears that they may not have converted too deeply to Christianity. There are many clues that people like to find in the sonnets about who this might have been, her appearance, her character. Everything seems to match up. It's all circumstantial, but it's really great good fun, and I can recommend some books if anybody else gets curious about this.
There is a Bassano, isn't it, in...
Yes, that was one of the things that they mentioned. It's Bassano.
Yes,
it's in Venice. It takes place in
Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, Merchant of Venice. And also there's Emilia in, what is she in? Othello. Yeah. So both the names crop up, and they are both associated with Venice.
Yes.
So there are some interesting little tie-ins there. And we're going to finish up for you with a little instrumental piece by Thomas Morley of the Tax Rolls in the Same Parish again. instruments sometimes in humid weather get a little bit touchy. Last week would have been impossible, I think.
Thank you.
Very, very nice.
Thank you very much.
Did we get all of that? Yes, we got all of that on recording. Just what you didn't want, huh? All right, we are in Act 4. We're going to do all of Act 4 in one night tonight. How are we? At the first scene, again, takes place in the wood outside of Athens. And in this scene, all of the fairies but Puck and the king and queen and Bottom enter, and Bottom is still as an ass yet. As Oberon watches, there's a very fantastical love duet between Titania and Bottom, who is the ass yet, and finally Robin comes in and frees him from the charm. But let's read some of that duet. Beginning on line 1. Anybody want to be, who wants to be Titania? Millie, would you want to be Titania? All right. Who wants to be Bottom? You want to be Bottom, Paul?
Sure.
All right. I'll be Peas Blossom or Cobweb or whoever comes up.
Come sit thee down upon this flowery bed, while I thy amiable cheeks do coy, and stick musk roses in thy sleek smooth head, and kiss thy fair large ears, my gentle joy.
Where's Peas Bottom?
Ready?
Scratch my head, Peas Bottom. Where's Monsieur Cobweb?
Ready?
Monsieur Cobweb, good monsieur, get your weapons in hand and kill me a red-hipped bumblebee on the top of the thistle. And good monsieur, bring me the honey bag. Do not fret yourself too much in the action, monsieur. And good monsieur, have a care, the honey bag break not. I would be loath to have you o'erflown with honey bag, senor. Where's Monsieur Mustard Seed?
Ready?
Give me your knife,
Neef.
Knife. Monsieur Mustard Seed, pray you, leave your courtesy, good monsieur.
What's your will?
Nothing, good monsieur, but help cavalry Peas Bottoms to scratch. I must to the bobbers, monsieur, for methinks I am marvelous hairy about the face, and I am such a tender ass. If my hair but do tickle me, I must scratch.
What, wilt thou hear some music, my sweet love?
I have a reasonable good ear for music. Let's have the tongs and bones.
Or say, sweet love, what thou desirest to eat.
Truly, a peck of provender. I could munch your good dry oats. Methinks I have a great desire for a bottle of hay. Good hay, sweet hay, hath no fellow.
I have a venturous fairy that shall seek the squirrel's hoard and fetch the new nuts.
I had rather have a handful or two of dried peas. But I pray you, let none of your people stir me. I have an exposition of sleep come upon me.
Sleep thou, and I will wind thee in my arms. Fairies be gone, and be always away. And so doth the woodbine, the sweet honeysuckle, gently entwist the female ivy. So enrings the barky fingers of the elm. Oh, how I love thee, how I dote on thee.
Tim, do you want to read Oberon? It's a lovely speech.
Welcome, good Robin. Seest thou this sweet sight? The dotage now I do begin to pity. For meeting here of late behind the wood, seeking sweet favours for this hateful fool, I did upbraid her, and fall out with her. For she his hairy temples then had rounded with coronet of fresh and fragrant flowers, and that same dew which sometime on the buds was once to swell, like round and orient pearls, stood now within the pretty Floriette's eyes, like tears that did their own disgrace bewail. When I had at my pleasure taunted her, and she in mild terms begged my patience, I then did ask of her her changeling child, which straight she gave me, and her fairy sent to bear him to my bower in fairyland. And now I have the boy, I will undo this hateful imperfection of her eyes, and the gentle cup takes this transformed scalp from off the head of this Athenian swain, that he, awakening when the other do, may all to Athens back again repair. And think no more of this night's accidents, but as the fierce vexation of a dream. But first I will release the fairy queen. Be as thou wast wont to be, see as thou wast wont to see. Dian's buds or Cupid's flower had such force and blessed power. Now, my Titania, wake you, my sweet queen.
That's far enough. This play is very peculiar for more reasons than the fairies and the magic. It has more sleep scenes than any other play, and more of the success of the story depends on sleep than in any other play of Shakespeare, and maybe in any play anywhere. So this brings us into another huge, big subject, which we're going to just touch again, and that is the subject of sleep and rest. It's really a tough one. It's one of those subjects that has all kinds of opposite meanings on different levels, and we're just going to do a really simple kind of view of it. From the mysteries, we get the notion that much more time is spent in sleep or in rest than in creation. This would be a real fancy diagram. There it is. If we take linear time, now let's just take the whole idea of the cosmic mysteries, a creation, an entire creation, starting at this period in time, ending in this period in time. Half the time is spent between creative manifestations and rest. And then between each of the successive periods, sun period, Saturn period, moon period, half the time is again spent in rest. Then between each revolution, half the time is spent in rest. And between globes, half the time is spent in rest, and between epochs, and between incarnations. So it turns out that all of these are various grades of rest, and it gets down to, with just a very few simple things, that 64ths of time in creation is spent resting. Now, this is a sort of a skewed example, because we don't know that everything is of equal length, and it is based on relative rest versus relative activity. But the whole idea is there that in a creation, an enormous amount of time is spent not in the active doing of the creation. A lot more time is spent in rest activity. If we look at our lives, we find that we have rest periods every day. And when we arise from those rest periods, we're very much refreshed and energized, and we have a big change of consciousness. And we go to work, and we perform our functions, and slowly, as the day goes on, we lose more and more. We're less awake, we're weaker, and finally we're starting to make mistakes and even get cranky, and we get to the point that we couldn't continue on even with stimulants. So even though we would like to go on, we collapse in sleep. Normally, if we look from the outside only, it seems that we do nothing in sleep except maybe dream a little bit. From the viewpoint of material science, sleep is something of a mystery. Some of the notions of the going to sleep mechanism are understood by physiology. Hey, Jerry. There are two families of elements, basically, that operate in the body. One is the potassium family, and it contains phosphorus and magnesium and a few other elements, and it is associated with the sun. And it does the work inside of the cells, right inside of them. The lunar family includes sodium and aluminum and calcium and a few other elements, and the lunar family is more associated with the interstitial or intercellular fluids. And most of the energy in the body is spent maintaining the balance between the sodium family and the potassium family. Even if we sit and do nothing but read, or sit and veg out and watch television or something like that, we're still expending an enormous amount of energy in the maintaining the metabolic balance between sodium and potassium, or between the moon and the sun. Gradually, at the end of the day, at least from the physical point of view, it seems like the moon begins to win and begins to invade a little bit into the cells. And when that occurs, there is a slightly increased production of lactic acid. And the lactic acid collects somewhere in the hypothalamus region of the brain, and from the physical point of view, one goes to sleep. So, roughly speaking, the whole notion of drinking a glass of milk to go to sleep is true. It has it relates to the natural process of going to sleep. There is some difference in the physiology of sleep versus being awake. The anabolism is less active, but the catabolism, the cleaning up and the breaking down, takes over. It's very much like in a fast. We even call it break fast for breakfast in the morning. And in such a condition, the cleansing work takes place. Most of the interactions that take place in our bodies are very delicate balances and are accomplished through the interplay of changing interbalances, whether it's sodium-potassium or whether it's anabolism and catabolism. We maintain these balance. However, what we know about the physiological activities of going to sleep and what occurs during sleep describe some of the condition of the physical body, but they don't describe the very radical change of consciousness that we have between periods of sleep. This is because the change is not primarily physical. In sleep, the spirit takes the higher bodies and leaves just the physical and the lower ethers of the vital body. It leaves them to basically live in a trance-like existence. The spirit then, freed from the body, all of the vehicles get harmonized by the grace and the love that flows through the different spiritual realms. And as a consequence, each body is harmonized with the cosmos, and it begins to work rhythmically again, and it isn't so driven by self-seeking self-interests. And so the higher vehicles get strengthened by a spiritual flow, and the spirit then has something to work with, and then toward morning they reunite with the physical body and do a lot to restore it. So actually, though it seems like we're just laying there in our beds, or lying there in our beds, we're actually extremely, extremely busy. In what we call rest, there is much more than just restorative work, as in cosmic rests. So sleep is not a quiescent state as one would expect from outer appearances. It's just that a different, more inward kind of activity is taking place, and that activity is quite vigorous. The activity that takes place in rests, whether it be between lives or whether it be between great periods of manifestation or between days, is divided into two phases. Our daily experience is enormous. We experience more things than we know we experience. We don't even know that we remember them. And it takes something like an out-of-the-body experience where we go back over everything we experienced to know what we are missing. God does not waste any of our experience. So nothing of this can be lost. So it all has to be remembered, which is one of the activities that takes place in sleep, and it has to all be processed. My favorite example is if you go for a walk in the woods, it's beautiful, and it feels wonderful, the birds are singing, and all of the leaves are swaying, the trees are swaying, and the leaves are fluttering, and it's a wonderful experience. It's very uplifting. However, if you went with the botanist and a biologist or a zoologist or a geologist on the same walk, they could tell you all sorts of other things about what you were seeing that, if done properly, would in no way take away from the experience of the sylvan scene. Similarly, if we took a poet and a painter and somebody who had an eye for things like that, the trip could be enriched even more. So whether we know it or not, we live in an enormous sea of information. And none of it is lost, but it takes a long time to process it. So in the sleep, or in between lives, or in a cosmic night, the first activity is an activity of re-experiencing everything, drawing in all of the past experience and mulling over it. Just the re-experiencing of it can cause breakthroughs at various levels. So it's a process that brings us to a totally different perspective. Because when things are undone, we see things from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And we get some kind of a divine overview so that we are neither involved in the doing or in the undoing in the process of seeing it from both perspectives. But all of these things take great time, and they require a high degree of consciousness, which we don't possess yet. We're not all botanists, or we're not all poets. And though we may enjoy something and the experience may be uplifting to us, everything that it means to us in our life isn't clear to us. So this means that for quite a few lives, we're carrying around a lot of information that we don't know the meaning of. And so we have an enormous backlog of experience. We're carrying a great deal of undigested experience. Even if it is all broken down and analyzed and understood and absorbed and assimilated into the spirit, it still takes a long time for it to sink in. Experience requires, even with fairly astute attention, takes a long time for something to dawn on us as to what it means. And so this is the first stage of the activity in rest. It is that kind of absorption with the past. When it has sunk in and it becomes the stuff of excitement to new creation, then the new creation takes a long time, because we work with so many other hierarchs in the grand evolutionary creation, and because we have so much destiny and because it's such a complicated thing, it takes a lot of time to plan things. It's much more time than planning a picnic. And on top of that, when we are doing creative work, it takes a long time for new ideas to incubate and unfold. So, a lot of the period in a rest is spent processing, and a lot of the time in a rest period is spent in planning or projecting, because it requires so much to maintain this kind of consciousness in this world that everything has to be thought out, so that when we do have the experience here, as long as we can sustain it, it has to be very concentrated. So it's not surprising then that when we go to sleep, we have one attitude, and when we wake up, we seem almost like we're different people. We see it in children all the time. And it's not surprising that in a great cosmic night that we should go to sleep as a plant and reawaken in the next creative day as an animal-like being. Because the past experience sinks in deeply enough, and we absorb it so deeply and creatively work with it that we can make those major changes. So in this play, when all of the transformations take place in sleep, it's not unusual. It's exactly what you would expect. Some of the transformations could take place, and they do, for example, in The Tempest. They take place in a waking state. But in this play, almost everything is done during sleep. And it's almost as if Shakespeare is trying to tell us, rather than just merely using a dramatic ploy, it's as though Shakespeare is trying to tell us that it is very important what transpires in sleep and what we can get out of it. And that brings us to one more aspect of sleep, and that is the loss of consciousness. Because we have not yet developed sufficient soul from our experiences, and because we have not completely organized the soul material from our experiences, and because we have not yet learned how to transfer our waking consciousness to the higher vehicles without the physical body, when we leave the physical body, even in death, we're in something like a sleep state. We're awake after we die, but not awake in the same way as we are as a volitional act of self-consciousness. A divine self-becoming because we want to be. So, the work that we have in the sleep state, when we go to sleep every night, we may very well be doing service work there. We may very well be being schooled there, or taking part in some kind of creative activity. But we don't remember it because it isn't self-consciousness. Even the growth that we make from rebirth to rebirth, as startling as it may be from one life to the next, we're not completely aware of it. This is what we talked about last time, that black box effect, that sometimes we lose connection between cause and consequence, and we try to fill that gap with some kind of rationalization. So it's again as if Shakespeare's trying to tell us something about sleeping and waking, and how little we know, how many gaps we have in consciousness, and like we think because we are awake right now and that our consciousness of ourself is something that is eternal, we think that they should persist all the time. But because we have these gaps, because we fall asleep, this is not true. And Shakespeare's trying to tell us that. Because when miraculous things happen, it means that you haven't been in control all the way through. And it's like Shakespeare's trying to tell us, hey, Take a look, see what happens. Wake up. And at this point in the play, everybody does get waked up. Along around line 106, Theseus and Hippolyta and Aegeus and the whole company of people come in, and they are on an early morning hunt. And, I don't know. I'll read Theseus. Liz, you want to read Hippolyta? I'll start. Go, one of you, find out the forester, for now our observation is performed, and since we have the byword of the day, my love shall hear the music of my hounds, uncouple in the western valley. Let them go. Dispatch, I say, and find the forester. We will, fair queen, up to the mountain's top, and mark the musical confusion of hounds and echo in conjunction.
I was with Hercules and Cadmus once, when in a wood of Crete they bathed the bear, with hounds of Sparta. Never did I hear such gallant chiding, for besides the groves, the skies, the fountains, every region near seemed all one mutual cry. I never heard so musical a discord, such sweet thunder.
My hounds are bred out of the Spartan kind, so flued and sanded, and their heads are hung with ears that sweep away the morning dew, crook-kneed and dew-lapped like Thessalian bulls, slow in pursuit, but matched in mouth like bells. Under each under each, a cry more tunable was never hollowed to, nor cheered with horn in Crete, in Sparta, nor in Thessaly. Judge when you hear, but soft, what nymphs are these? At this point, let's just break for a second here. I have been out hunting in the night under the moon with baying hounds, and though I wouldn't consider it an activity at all that I would like to participate in now, I have to admit it's beautiful. And even though hunting has become a horrible thing in our society, it's become all about killing and bragging, and it has little to do with survival, and it even has little to do with skill. It doesn't take much skill. You know, they shoot deer from as much as a half a mile away, and the deer don't even know that they're in danger. They have telescopes, and then they shoot and they see where the bullet hits near the deer, and then they aim, because the deer doesn't know to run away. There's nothing, and this is, and they've got radar devices for telling where all the fish are. So that it's no longer a guessing game. And there are a lot of very, very unkind things. But nonetheless, it can be very beautiful to be out on a hunt with dogs and hear those sounds. It's part of nature. And as nature goes on, there is a lovely beauty in it. It's just that I don't think that most as humans need to be involved in that. At this point, the couples are noticed sleeping, and Theseus has them all awakened by blasts of the horn. And one by one they wake up, and each of them has a different take on what has happened. Who wants to be Lysander? Bob, you want to be Lysander? No. Just read the speech beginning at 149. My lord.
Pardon, my lord. I know you two are rival enemies. How comes this?
No, the next speech down, Lysander's. My lord.
Okay. My lord, I shall reply amazedly. half sleep, half waking, but as yet, I swear, I cannot truly say how I come here. But as I think, for truly when I speak, and now I do bethink me, so it is, I came with Hermia hither. Our intent wins to be gone from Athens, where we might, without the peril of the Athens Athenian law.
His speech is clearly a speech of confusion about how things came to be as they are. He is very, very descriptive of what we are like. Half asleep, half awake. Some wondrous things have occurred around us, and we're not even sure why or how they have occurred, because we have that discontinuity of consciousness. Again, primarily because we do have that break in consciousness, and we can't follow something from whence to whither. We can't carry along and see the whole process as it goes. Let's take a few lines from Demetrius. Aegeus says, "Enough, enough, my lord, you have enough of. I beg the law upon his head. They would have stolen away. They would. Demetrius, thereby you have defeated you and Demetrius, thereby to have defeated you and me. You of your wife and me of my consent." Wow. Of my consent that she should be your wife. Paul can be Demetrius.
My lord, fair Helen told me of their stealth, but of this their purpose thither to this wood, and I in fury hither followed them, fair Helena in fancy following me. But, my good lord, I want not by what power, but by some power it is, my love to Hermia, melted as the snow, seems to me now, as the remembrance of an idle god, which in my childhood I did dote upon, and all in the faith, the virtue of my heart, the object and the pleasure of mine eye, is only Helena. To her, my lord, I was betrothed ere I saw Hermia, but like in sickness did I loathe this food. But as in health come to my natural taste, now do I wish it, love it, long for it, and will forevermore be true to it.
This is, to me, a very interesting passage. He's describing his state as his previous true love. The first thought that's interesting about it is that Helena's naivete, as we saw it, that all she had to do was tell Demetrius and he would be grateful to her, we looked at that as being a little naive and foolish to think that it would happen that way. But it did happen that way. Of course, there was the intervention of magic. It still doesn't hold much water with me, but I don't know if Shakespeare is trying to say here that if you carry on an innocent belief in love, it will carry through. When Demetrius is describing his previous true love to Helena, it's very interesting the way he describes it. He doesn't, at first it's a rationalization, saying it wasn't true and therefore it melted away. And this is what we do, because we don't have the observation and we don't have the complete continuity of consciousness from one state through the transformation to another state. We bullshit. We rationalize and we try to fill in the gap. We try to fill the black box with our own thoughts, and this is exactly what Demetrius is doing. It's a giant rationalization. But what is interesting is he describes his state as a memory. He describes his new state as a memory. and his previous love for Helena. This is important because the consciousness, when we are away from our physical bodies, is very different than our consciousness when we are with them. In the first place, in our physical bodies, we are extremely subject to gravity. When we are in our soul bodies, we are not. And it then feels like we're falling. And because we have the insecurity of landing from the fall, it becomes very uncomfortable to be out of your body at first because it feels like you're perpetually falling. When you get used to the idea that you're not going to go down with a boom and hurt yourself or something like that, I'm sure that even the psychology of the whole fall of humanity fits into this kind of consciousness. And when you get used to it, then it's very hard to come back to the body again. That has to do with matter and space. But if we look at time and spiritual consciousness in time, when we're out of the body, we are not subject to as severe of limitations of linear time. And similar to the way that everything feels like falling, when you're out of the body, everything seems timeless. And instead of proceeding from one thing to another thing to another thing in your consciousness, when things come into your consciousness, no matter whether they're coming from what we call the past or whether they're coming from what we call the future, they feel like memory. This is why a lot of mystics make the claim that all education is memory, that you're remembering what you have known all the while. It's a little bit of shaky of a philosophy, but you can see how it occurs when you once get the experience. It happens very often to people like who are fortune tellers. They see things in the ethers, and they don't know whether it's something that has already happened or whether it's something that's going to happen because they don't have a controlled clairvoyance. And so the whole thing then is like entering into the inner worlds and like the initiate drinking the cup of remembrance, which is always what happens at an initiation. In fact, the word for truth is aletheia. And Lethe, we know, is the river of forgetfulness. So when you came to rebirth, you drank from the waters from the river Lethe, the waters of forgetfulness, and you forgot about the spiritual worlds, and you were only too happy to exist in this world. When you again awaken, or when you positively awaken in the other world, you take the drink of aletheia, which means the drink of truth. In fact, the name Alice or Alicia are the same word. They come back from Lethe, and so truth is not forgetting anymore. It's especially not forgetting the source of truth. And as we know in the Christian context, when we are ready to unite and have communion with the life spirit, that Christ kind of consciousness, we drink of the cup, this do in remembrance of me. So it has all of that quality about it. We're not going to talk a lot about the marriages this time. Next time we'll get to talking about some about the marriages. Let's look at the really brief but very significant speeches of the women. Penny, would you read Hermia's one-liner there at around 191? Methinks.
Methinks I see these things with parted eye, and everything seems double.
This is a perfect statement of spiritual sight. She's seeing things double. She's in a recognition that there are two levels of experience. Very brief speech, but it is really important. On one hand, we have clairvoyance. And clairvoyance is a sensitivity, a cultured sensitivity and a trained sensitivity that we can perceive what is really there. There's a clairvoyance in the physical world. On another level, we have insight, intuitive insight, which is a divine spiritual knowing. Some people have insights without the trained and cultured sensitivity. Some people have clairvoyance without the insights. But Helena is indicating something like a beginning of an awareness of two levels of consciousness. That is, a level of consciousness that is of another world, insightful, and of a lower realm of pure perception. All right. I'm sorry, that was for Maya's speech. Now let's try Helena's. Millie, do you want to try Helena's speech?
And I have found Demetrius like a jewel, mine own and not mine own.
All right, and skip the. Yeah, that goes far enough. She recognizes the fact that she's in love, but intuitively she realizes that it's really not hers. Like the beauty of a gem belongs to the gem because it's part of its property. And she seems to have grown in her love to the point where she recognizes that she doesn't really own it. At this point, I want to take a side trip. And this becomes one of those painful side trips because I need help. I'm in a process where I'm rethinking something all over again, and it has to do with what has transpired in the last two scenes. And we can do that now that all of the rivalries have been resolved and everybody is aligned the way they're going to be aligned. I want to look at the technique utilized in this play and in some of the other plays. And that is the technique of humor or of comedy in confusion. It's been used several ways in this play, and I'm not sure that I understand it. I'm rethinking my whole view on humor. Some psychologists have said that we find things humorous when we have a relaxation, and things that previously gave us anxiety or that we were worried or concerned about, when those anxieties are relieved, we feel perked up and we feel happy and we feel like we want to laugh. That is a very good view of humor. It's a little bit broad, but it doesn't cover everything, and this is why I'm going into this all over again. There's called the Laughing Man Buddhism. It's a form of Buddhism that believes that you can laugh yourself into heaven. Sort of like when you have your tension relieved, you laugh, and then that relaxes you more, and you laugh more until you're relaxed to the point that you awaken in a completely transcendent state, and you become a laughing Buddha at that point. In this case, we're talking about confusion. The word confusion literally means to see or to put two things together as though they were one. in this play, we have some of the other meanings of confusion. One of the dictionary meanings is to mix one up or to disturb one's mind is to cause confusion. Or to fail to differentiate, as when Lysander and Demetrius can't tell each other's voice from Puck's, and they confuse one for the other. In A Comedy of Errors, Shakespeare does something even much more with confusion. There's two sets of twins, a master and a clown as a servant, and another master and another clown as a servant, and both masters are twins, and both servants are twins, only they don't know of the existence of each other. And then Shakespeare brings them together in various different kinds of consciousness, and all kinds of nonsensical things come out of it. And it seems really funny. I've had a situation similar to that one time. I don't know if any of you know Bill Elliott. He's sort of a new agey writer. And he is almost a duplicate for a friend of mine named Gar, but a few years younger than Gar. But they look almost identical to each other. And so I run into Bill Elliott, and we're in the middle of University Avenue. I meet him in a crosswalk, and I start talking to him like I haven't seen you for a long time, and I start this conversation, only I think I'm talking to Gar. And he must have thought, I didn't realize what had happened until a half an hour later. And he must have thought that I just lost it completely. When I thought back on it, then it seemed funny. Nonsense itself. If in Comedy of Errors there are all of these nonsense planes, why should we find nonsense funny? You know what I mean? If you try to make a sentence that doesn't mean anything, it's almost impossible to do. And when you find a situation that is utterly meaningless, there is, I guess, in the psychologist's point of view, there is a relief of tension. The fact that something can be nonsense and nobody gets hurt by it, or that it doesn't make any difference. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out. And if any of you get ideas about the psychology of humor or the spiritual philosophy of humor, I would very, very much appreciate it. I don't know if it's because we're trying to make sense of nonsense that it's so funny. And it's not because it's nonsense alone. Recently, I had a chap come by and he rambled on with nonsense for 20 minutes. And it wasn't in the least bit funny because he meant it all seriously. He's chronically mentally ill, and it wasn't in the least funny, though some people find madmen and drunkards, they find them funny. I can't find it funny.
What's the explanation here? Lost in New York. That's funny.
You could say it's because you know it isn't nonsense, and having that purview that it seems funny, but that seems a little too stilted to me. I just can't.
Stilted, that's a good word. I have a philosophical difference with my best friend over that word. Stilted is a different.
Last week, or the last time we met, we looked at Bottom's pretentious misuse of words, and he confused one word for another, He was trying to use a word that was beyond the reach of his vocabulary, and he was really showing his ignorance, and the juxtaposition of the truth and the confusion side by side seemed funny. A pun is a confusion of two meanings with one sound. They both have the same sound, but there are two meanings for it. And we find that funny, or at least I do. It seems like the perspective has something to do with it. For example, from the material perspective, where differentiation is all important, to confuse or to not be able to differentiate one thing from another thing when that differentiation should be made seems humorous. Just like Bottom couldn't differentiate one word from the misword. From the spiritual perspective, it's a matter of somebody seeing two things as the same that are not the two things as different that are really the same. You know what I'm trying to say? If you have the overall spiritual unity of consciousness, you can see that two things are really the same thing as they are like in a mathematical consciousness. Like with an identity, you can see that two things that appear vastly different from each other, if you see them from the universal perspective, you can see that they actually do resolve into each other. At this point, I'm beginning to feel, I should give one more thing. A double entendre is where the same set of words has two different meanings on two different levels. So I'm just, my thought at this point is that maybe humor is a realization of a relationship, whether the two things seem the same but aren't, or whether two things seem different when they really are not. In either case, what is shared in humor is the consciousness, and that any realization of consciousness that takes us away from our dull limitation, our dark ways of seeing things, is what makes something humorous. But that's where I'm going at this point. And if you come up with a good psychology of humor, I would be very glad to go into it. All right, we want to, this is all very little Shakespeare tonight, and way too much of Richard Koepsel. You want to read Bottom's speech now?
It has no bottom to it.
Yes, I know.
Oh, is that my cue? When my cue comes?
Yep.
Call me and I will answer. My next is Most Fair Pyramus, Hi-ho, Peter Quince, Flute and bellows mender, Snout the tinker, starveling. God's my life, stolen hence, and left me asleep. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream. Past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Man is but an ass, if he go about to expound this dream. He thought I was, there is no man can tell that. He thought I was, and methought I had, but man is but patched fool, if he will offer to say what he thought I had. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen. Man's hand hath not been able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom. And I will sing it in the latter end of a play before the Duke. Peradventure, to make it the more gracious, I will sing it at her death. I shall sing it at her death.
That's probably the best speech of the entire play and the most significant. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of men to say what dream it was. He's talking about something superhuman, past the wit of men. Man is but an ass to expound upon this dream. He's talking about secrecy, but secrecy that is born of reverence. Eye hath not heard, ear hath not seen. He's having an overlapping of the senses. He's trying to indicate both the limitation of the senses and of an experience that is so whole and so total that it makes the senses appear as little peepholes and nothing more. He's talking about something that is clearly otherworldly. And when he goes on to say, I shall sing it at her death, he's talking about a swan song. And a swan song is the initiate's song. Whether it is in initiation when one tells one's whole life to God in confession, or whether it is when one sings out with one's own note the true spiritual song as seen from the point of view of the new initiate. A swan song is an initiate song. In The Winter's Tale, we noted a very quaint thing about setting. We talked about the wrecked ship and the bear eating a man, and we said that this described a loon from the North Pole to the South Pole. We could have been more convincing about it, and we could have gone deeply into that, into astromythology and the mysteries, but there wasn't enough there, and that might even have seemed to have been a coincidence. In this play, setting plays a much, much larger role, and it is much more convincingly related to the mysteries. Bottom alludes to not talking about his dream, which when he was such a braggart before seems like a complete change of consciousness. His dream was much more, as we can tell from this speech. It's worth at least 3 or 4 readings. It was much more than just cavorting with fairies. And it is a great honor to even cavort with the fairies, because you have to be pure at heart. So for all of his braggadocio, Bottom is not a harmful person. So if he wants to keep this out of secret, a secret out of reverence, we're talking about a setting and a circumstance that dovetail. Most of the action takes place in the woods outside of Athens. More specifically, it takes place at the King's Oak, in an oak grove outside of Athens. And that is a place where for hundreds of years the Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated. Hundreds of people were initiated into the inner mysteries. They were public celebrations and inner mysteries at the same time. But out of those hundreds of people, no one ever revealed the secrets of the Eleusinian mysteries. It's a marvel to modern historians that people would be so closed-mouthed. The Eleusinian mysteries were related to the story of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who was sometimes called Chlore. We're going to go into them extremely briefly. I have several tapes from an earlier rendition about 9 years ago, but even those several tapes are light. They're different than what we're going to do tonight, but there's still not enough to really get at it. The mysteries were celebrated publicly and privately. Some were in a special ceremony in the oak grove, and later they had buildings for the initiations. But they were living out parts of the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter was the second child to Cronus and Rhea, the Titans. And Zeus was the sixth child. Demeter was swallowed by her father, as were all of the other children except Zeus. Some say that she is the mother of Dionysus, that Zeus united with his sister, and from them Dionysus was born. Others have a different origin. The name Demeter means barley mother. And in Rome, she was known as Ceres, which is where our word cereal comes from. Her brother Poseidon lusted after her, but she never married him. She bore Kore, or Persephone, to Zeus. She also bore Plutus, the god of wealth, not Pluto, but Plutus. And he was born to Demeter and Aeacus, which is the Greek form of Jesus, which we won't go into. And he was born as a romp in the middle of a wet cornfield at one time. She came back to the wedding ceremony all smudged with mud, but with a big grin on her face. Demeter was very gentle and very, very mild. But if people went against her again and again, she could prove to be a very violent power if necessary. All of the joy went out of the life of Demeter when her daughter Persephone, or Kore, was out picking flowers. Shakespeare says they were daffodils. This is daffodils. She was abducted by Hades, and she was taken into Tartarus, where she was made the wife of Hades. Demeter became very, very downhearted, and for 9 days she wouldn't eat, but all she did is wandered the entire surface of the earth looking for her daughter. It so happens that the mysteries of Demeter were celebrated in 9 days. And the only thing that she heard was the echoes of a cry from the moon goddess Hecate, who said, a rape, there's been a rape. On the 10th day she came to Elysius, and at Elysius she disguised herself as a human, and she became a wet nurse to Demophon, who was the youngest son of King Celeus. But even as a woman and as a wet nurse, she was sad. And Celeus had a daughter, a lame daughter, called Iambe, which is from which our iambic pentameter comes. And Iambe tried to cheer her up by singing to her naughty poetry, bawdy stories. And as a result, in the mysteries both of Demeter and the mysteries of India, naughty jokes to relieve the tension were part of the tension about sexuality, were part of the mysteries. So they were filled with double entendres, which again opened the mind to one or more levels of consciousness. And so we can say our lovely sonnets now trace their origin back to iambi and something like limericks. There was a wet nurse called Bauble, and she lifted up her skirts, and they had sneaked in one of the children of Demeter, and when they lifted up the skirts, he came out as though he were born, and they still could not do anything to get her out of her doldrums. And one day, she has an entire pitcher of barley water with mint floating in it, and she just chug-a-lugs the whole pitcher. And Abbas, who is another one of the sons of Celeus, criticized her, saying that was not ladylike to drink a whole pitcher of barley water. And she looked at him so sternly that he turned into a lizard. The child Demophon that she was wet nurse to, she was trying to make immortal. And she did this every night by holding the child in a sacred sacrificial fire. And one day, as she's doing this, somebody stumbles into the hall where she's doing it, and it breaks the spell. And what happens is that she kills the boy. The fire burns him up. And having only 3 sons left, those 3 sons of Celeus that remained were Triptolemus, who was a cowherd, and he gave witness to the fact of the abduction. In fact, he even warned that it was going to be taking place. Eumolpus was the 2nd son, and he was a shepherd, and he gave further testimony. And the youngest son of the surviving was Eubuleus, and he was a swineherd. Remember in the Winter's Tale when we talked about those dancing 12, that 3 of them were neatsherds, and 3 of them were shepherds, and 3 were swineherds? That goes back to the mysteries of Demeter. But at any rate, Eubuleus, I don't know how to pronounce it, was the last one to see Chloe alive as she was being taken into a crevice in the earth, pulled on a chariot of Hades, pulled by 4 black horses. So she took their testimony and the testimony of Hecate, and they finally persuaded Helios, the sun who sees everything and knows everything, to give testimony. And she goes to her brother Zeus and she says, I want my daughter back. And so Zeus sends Hermes down into the underworld to get the daughter back, and Hades refuses. And he has equal power in the underworld to that which Zeus has in the heavens and which the other brother Poseidon has in the oceans. So she's not to be deferred. So what happens is she continues to wander the earth and lets nothing grow. And Zeus becomes alarmed, and he says, Hermes back, and he says, you've got to let this girl go, because if you don't let her go, you're going to have a whole glut of people all at one time coming to the underworld, because they're all going to die of starvation. But after that, you're not going to get any more, because nothing's going to grow on the earth. And so finally, Hades sees this, being greedy as he was, and he says, I'll agree to this on one condition, provided she has eaten none of the food of the underworld. And she says she hadn't. But just as she was leaving the underworld to go back to her mother, Ascalaphus, who lived in the underworld, started hooting and jeering and saying he saw her one day pick out a pomegranate and chew on 7 seeds. And when asked this, she had to say so. So this upset the whole bargain, and they had to remake the bargain so that 3 months of the year she would spend in the underworld with Hades, and everything on earth would die, and it would be winter. And the other 9 months of the year, she would come up and be with her mother, and everything would be lively and plush on the earth. Asclepius was put into a hole, and a stone was rolled over it. And when he was finally let out, many years later, he was turned into a short-eared owl that hooted all night long. Demeter, when she got her daughter back, rewarded everybody by giving them all kinds of grains for grain food, but she forbade, in any country where the people worshipped her, forbade the eating of beans. All of the different mysteries disliked Rudolf Steiner, Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras. Everybody disliked bean eating. I don't know why it was, but they each give a different reason for it. So that it's apparently important eating beans, even as a symbol. But at any rate, she gave Triptolemus a plow that was drawn by serpents, and she taught him the art of agriculture, which is shorthand for agriculture, meaning the culture of souls. And the mysteries were then in the hands of Triptolemus, who was the first hierarch of the Eleusinian mysteries, and for hundreds of years afterwards, the role of Triptolemus was the role of the Hierophant. So this is the story that was used to act out, to change the life of someone becoming an initiate. Still, other myths tell us that the mysteries of Demeter did come in this way, but they actually originated in Thesmorphia in Egypt, and that they were brought in that way. And if you look at the story of the wanderings of Isis and put it next to the wanderings of Demeter, there are a lot of similarities. They both put a child in the fire to immortalize it. They were both wet nurses, and both did all sorts of things like that. Thesmorphia is very interesting. Thes is from our words, the same word that we use for thespian, meaning one who acts, and morphia means a transformation. So thesmorphia is shorthand for saying one has a transformation of consciousness by acting out a role. And that's what the mysteries were all about. All of the mysteries had several ends: education and advancement of evolutionary purposes. They were all designed to put the initiate in touch with the divine source, and to do it in such a way that they could renew that connection at will, if not continuously, by inward skill. And one of the purposes of the mysteries was to produce people of good character, which the Eleusinian mysteries did in spades. All of the remarkably high character people of the ancient world were initiates in the Eleusinian mysteries. And of course, it initiated people into states of future consciousness that human beings will have at another time. Plato was an initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries, and he actually took an Egyptian initiation. Sophocles was also an Eleusinian initiate. So it was a process of living through a divine myth and living through it with such sincerity that something in you changed by being able to realize that you were something more than the habitual, undersold conception of yourself that you have in daily life. So it was an acting experience. All of the ancient mysteries were thesmorphic. There were very few people that could go into the greater mysteries and have these kinds of awakenings or enlightenments. There was a ceremony. That's another word. Not only serial, but ceremony comes from series. It goes back to the same mysteries. In a modern initiation, one doesn't need a myth to live out or act out. One sees within one's own consciousness what is there and what potential and what one can become. And with assistance, one learns how to become a being of different consciousness. And it is a completely spiritual act. It does not require anything physical. One need not be entranced. One need not be physically deprived in any way. One just changes one's consciousness spiritually. There are two stages to initiation, either ancient or modern initiation. And the first is remembering, which word itself is an allusion to the mysteries. You remember Osiris was cut into different parts, and Isis remembered him, put him back together until he became spiritually whole again and was resurrected. In a modern initiation, one remembers as much of this life and of previous rebirths as one is capable of taking. That is, we must admit to what we did, right or wrong, helpful or harmful, painful or pleasurable to others. And the more that we can admit to of ourselves and see through to the principles within, the more soul power we remember into us so that we can go into the second part of initiation. And the second part of initiation is seeing divine potential. And in seeing that divine potential, one can then take the soul power and be a magician. No one in the modern sense of an initiate is an initiate without also being a magician. That is capable of great transmutations even of physical matter. So you think until the memory comes back to you and you have to see it for what it was. We've been looking at the two levels of this myth. We've been looking at the Christ cycle on the loftiest level, and we'll return to that next week. We're going to meet next Thursday again. And we've been looking at it as the cycle of Persephone, of the ethers coming in and out of the surface of the earth and relivening nature, and the parallel activities to the nature cycle, the cycle of Persephone, to the spiritual cycle. The way the Eleusinians looked at this mystery was on several other levels. Demeter represents much more than Mother Earth, much more than a bodily mother. Demeter, to the Eleusinian mysteries, represented the feminine, the divine feminine, the life spirit. And Kore, or Persephone, represented the individual, the human spirit, the unique soul, so to speak. And this gets abducted by desire into the Tartarus, the world of the dead. And in this rendition, in the Eleusinian mysteries, this is the world of the dead. And we are really dead, and we have been abducted here by desire. Primarily materialistic and sexual desire has drawn us to this level. Initiation then represented a reunion with the mother, with the life spirit. And this is true of all initiations. Madame Blavatsky, the great theosophist, said all initiation begins with Uranus and Neptune, meaning the life spirit and the human spirit. That when you can see the self relative to the selfness of the divine feminine, that you then have the humility, you know the divinity of yourself, but you also keep it in proportion relative to the divine oversoul of the mother, of the life spirit. The various parts of the story were acted out, and they're acted out in other mysteries, such as the Christian mysteries. On one day, I believe it was the first or second day of the mysteries, they drove the swine of Eubulius down to the sea and drove them into the water. And that was part of the early part of the initiation, the driving out of the impure desires. And after that, one was initiated into the agriculture of Triptolemus. We could go on and on and on. We could point and say that this part of the myth means this and this part of the myth means that, but that's all ostensive. I really don't like that sort of thing. What is important always is the life. All we have is our life. And when we live our lives fully, that is what accomplishes the initiation. It's much more important to live it out. Even if I would like to go into the Eleusinian mysteries in detail, it's just too big to do. So let's just take one part of it and look at it. Demeter is pictured as a human body with a horse's head. It is not an accident. That bottom has an unspeakable experience while wearing an ass's head. He is having the experience of Demeter, of the life spirit. There's much more to it than that. Lucian of Apuleius, who is called the golden ass of Apuleius, was transformed into an ass in his initiation into the mysteries of Isis. And in that state, he was subject to all the bestial desires. If you remember, probably Paul's the only one, or Jerry maybe, we talked about the Japanese imperial myth. And Susanoo, of the Japanese imperial origin, he was sort of the bad guy hero, had an experience as a piebald horse. The piebald horse or the piebald ass is common to all of the mystery schools and to all of the heroes who go through them in the ancient world, no matter what the society is. I've dug up the oldest source that I know of it, and this is probably as early as 10,000 BC. And from all places, from India, where the India boy is that we were talking about. This is a statement from the Rig Veda. O Asvins, you placed the horse head on Dadayak, the son of the Arthvedan priest. He, being honest, told you about the honey of Travastar that was hidden from you who accomplish wondrous deeds. And a few centuries later, we read this in the one of the Brahmanas. When you accept us as pupils, we will cut off your head and put it somewhere else. Then we will bring a horse's head and place it upon you. With that you will teach us, and when you have taught us, then Indra will cut off that head of yours. Then we will bring your own head and place it upon you again. He agreed and accepted them as pupils, and when he had received them as pupils, they cut off his head and placed it somewhere else. And they brought the head of a horse and placed it upon him. With that head he taught them, and when he had taught them, Indra cut off his head again, and they brought his own head and placed it on him. From other places, this is the horse head by which he told the Asvins the secret of the honey, the nectar to the Greeks. But we do not know where that head might be. And it goes on in other very early scriptures. I don't want to belabor the point too much. But you get the idea that the whole story of the India boy and the mysteries going back and forth between the mystics and the occultists and changing hands back and forth is what we're talking about. So bottom is undergoing an initiation that is like the Eleusinian initiation that took place in the woods outside of Athens. When Lucian was the golden ass of Apuleius, he was humbled by the experience. He was brought right to the edge of bestiality. Here he was an ass, and he was to copulate with a woman, and he was utterly shamed and humbled by that. And his shame and his humblement caused him then to see Isis and to be transformed so that he could see the midnight sun and all those other wonderful things that happened to him. At that point, it's almost too hard to even talk about. That's always what the first phase of initiation is. We are humbled because we can't come to our divine nature as long as we're all wrapped up in our personal egoism. And when we see for ourselves our bestiality, when we see our animal nature for what it is, and we're humbled and shamed and truly conscientious about our being, only then are we ready for the higher part of the mysteries. The higher part of the mysteries is also represented by the horse's head. In the modern mysteries, as in the ancient, when one was initiated, one took one's first soul flight. One could leave the body and be taught in the spiritual worlds as a member of the gods. Once you got beyond your bestial part of your nature, you could take a soul flight. Soul flights have always been represented by the ninth house and by the horse, by Sagittarius, the sign of the horse. Sagittarius then has come to represent the sign of the higher mind, of the true self, the divine idea. It also happens to be the home of Zeus, where the lightning strikes. I didn't go into all the quotes from the Brahmanas, but in one of the other Brahmanas, when the horse's head is on the Arthvaden priest, there is a lightning strike and an amazing awakening of consciousness, a Pentecostal experience where you see the lightning over the head. So putting on the horse's head represents putting on a divine, higher state of consciousness, an ideational state of consciousness where you get the divine idea. You get the grace from Demeter, from the life spirit, from the realm of Christ. You get the grace of that as a nectar. This is why all of these things, cut me a flower, a thistle bulb, and don't spill the nectar. All of the lines in there look just like simple, jokey little things, but that really is talking about something very spiritual. It shouldn't surprise us that it is Bottom who is the initiate. He's not caught up in all of the things that the aristocrats are caught up in. They're caught up in mating games, and they're caught up in hunting and matters of state. He may be braggadocious, but he's not bellicose. And in order to be initiate, you have to be harmless. And that's what he's like. It shouldn't surprise us that initiation is brought about by fairies. If every other transaction in our etheric bodies is brought about by fairies, why shouldn't the highest act be brought about by fairies? When the vital body is separated or stratified into the soul body versus the biological vital body. In all mysteries, fairies have played a large part. Elizabeth and I have a friend that was offered a fairy initiation when he was a very young man, just coming into puberty. The fairies came and got him out of bed, which they would do frequently. They'd find him away from the home, and he would be asleep under the tree when they'd find him the next morning. But the fairies had taken him out and had played with him. He turned down the fairy initiation because he wanted a Christian initiation. So the experience of Bottom is a reenactment of the individual, personal part of the Eleusinian mysteries of being like Demeter and putting off one head, the head that is all too human in the earthy sense, and putting on the horse's head, the head of soul flights. And the India boy was given back at that point. The whole play talks about the relationship of India to Greece. Actually, in the zodiac, the front door is ruled by Mars and Aries. And so new changes were always brought about by people of warfare. The Druidic mysteries, which influenced and highly impressed Pythagoras, were brought by warfare going to the east, culminating in Caesar actually overcoming Britain. The going to the west, Alexander the Great went all the way to India. Coming from the other direction, Asok, the famous Buddhist king, had missionaries that went all the way to Palestine. And you find artifacts of Buddhism in Ireland. So there was a lot of east-west things. Mythologically, Dionysus went all the way to India and brought the mysteries there. So what we're talking about is that the physical changes, the warfare changes, only make possible an easier flow from where the mysteries were once kept sacred because the society could maintain them. They're brought more and more into the Western world, and the secrecy is opened up a lot more. In the final scene, it takes place at the house of Peter Quince, and they're all downhearted because the play is about to go on and they don't have Bottom. And along around line 29, Bottom comes back in and they're all uplifted, and he said, "Masters, I am to discourse wonders, but ask me not what, for if I tell you, I am not a true Athenian. I will tell you everything right as it fell out. And then they start making a big deal of him, and his last statement in the play is, not a word of me. All that I will tell you is that the Duke hath dined. Get your apparel together, good strings to your beards, new ribbons to your pumps. Meet presently at the palace. Every man look o'er his part, for the short and the long is, our play is preferred. In any case, let Thisbe have clean linen, and let not him that plays the lion pare his nails, for they shall hang out for the lion's claws. And, most dear actors, eat no onions nor garlic, for we are to utter sweet breath, and I do not doubt but to hear them say it is a sweet comedy. No more words, away, go away. He shows in the first speech, Bottom, his reverence. He wouldn't be a true Athenian if he did tell. It'll come out eventually, he says, and you'll know then. And then in the second, in the final speech of the act, he says something that shows that he is indeed a transformed man. He takes over, he takes the leading role, but he doesn't do it with all of that braggadocio. He says, not a word of me. Boy, if each and every one of us could say that, not a word of me, I think our lives would be a lot better. Initiates had the can-do attitude, and they had the strength that Bottom had. Once we've stood up to our own nastiness, once we've gotten past the dweller of the threshold, which is composed of the remnants of all of our evil thoughts and desires and actions, and once we have seen the divine, we've got an understanding that we can do anything because we are co-creators. And just recognizing that fact alone, that we are part of the divine, is a big statement. I don't know about the garlic and onions. I know that the initiates to the mysteries were not supposed to eat roots, and they were supposed to stay away from things that produced excess semen, which both garlic and onions do, and they're highly sulfurous and luciferic, but I don't know, that's all just on the side. Next time we'll finish the play. There's not a lot of real heavy stuff in the play, and we'll go into our main theme and talk about the Christ cycle, and we'll talk about some of the astrology, I guess the cosmological astrology behind it, and some of the higher levels of it.